Thank you, Chair. I want to direct my question to Ms Griffin-Jones and Mr Buckley. How does the bank measure up against its peers, and who is its closest comparator?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the development, I suppose the regional development bank, so you would have to compare it with the Asian one and the Inter-American Development Bank in particular. There's some others, for example, in the Middle East. So you would need to compare maybe with those. And of course, the countries that we're talking about are quite different. I mean, Africa has now developed quite a lot, so a lot of countries are middle income, but they were recently, low income, and so they have, problems in infrastructure, in so many aspects, and so the challenge that an institution like the African Development Bank faces is so much bigger than in Latin America, and particularly in Asia, where things seem to happen a lot on their own. So I think that maybe, or perhaps one emphasis that one could have is to look a lot at, and I think that's also the spirit of this ICAI report, to look a lot not just on financial performance, although it is obviously important, but is the institution maximizing sustainable and inclusive development impact? And it's easier to say than to do, but I think there's a lot of research going on about how you can develop good matrices to try and do that. I think the African Development Bank is trying and doing a good job, but it could be improved. So, for example, they look at what is the impact of the financial operations on financial intermediaries, but could they also maybe go beyond and look at the companies to which these financial intermediaries lend? The companies, they've got the additional funds. So I think this emphasis on development impact, on poverty reduction, on sustainable development impact is absolutely crucial.
Mr Buckley, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with Stephanie that I think its closest, its closest examples would be the other regional development banks, perhaps the IFC, and so forth. I mean, it's very difficult to benchmark development institutions against each other because, as I said in my first response, I mean, every development institution has its own relative strengths and, frankly, relative weaknesses. So, I mean, the African Development Bank, without question, has the strongest relationships with African governments and has the strongest network of local representation. So, as a co-investor, or simply if we had an issue that we were trying to work through with an African government in an area, especially around infrastructure or power policy, I mean, African Development Bank is clearly the organization to go to. That's its relative strength. No one else has that. I mean, by comparison, there are probably other areas working with, insurance companies and pension companies, especially those in the West, where the African Development Bank is perhaps, relatively weaker. So it's difficult to do this sort of league table comparison. You have to do it on particular issues.
Okay, thank you. And based on those answers, Mr. Mazzari, how would you respond to those comments?
No, I think I very much agree with what Colin and Griffin-Jones have just said. Sorry, I must have mangled your name. There has been one thing that I want to point to is that there is a benchmarking exercise that's organised by the OECD DAC that's called MOPAN, which basically assesses organisations against their ability to deliver and to manage their performance effectively and manage for results. And what the MOPAN, the OECD DAC MOPAN assessment shows is it benchmarks different organisations against a range of different dimensions and shows that the African Development Bank does score quite highly at par with organisations like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. So clearly it has some strengths, it has some weaknesses like many organisations, but it's working very hard, I think, to address them.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you. If I could turn to the next question to my colleague,